If you haven't subscribed already, make sure you go do that. It takes 2 seconds. And with that out of the way, let's talk about Pharnavaz I. Pharnavaz was born a few thousand years ago, somewhere between 329 BC and 311 BC. The sparse records that we do have on him point to his father being one of the descendants of Kartlos, the founder of the first Georgian city of Kartli. It is likely that Pharnavaz's mother was the daughter of King Darius III, of the massive Achaemenid Persian Empire that had ruled Persia for the past 2 centuries. Pharnavaz would have been brought up fatherless and was most likely raised by his paternal uncle, who was the ruler of some of the Georgian tribes near the city of Kartli. At a young age, Pharnavaz would be forced to watch as his uncle and most of his family was killed or displaced when Alexander the Great invaded Iberia and eventually installed a puppet ruler named Azo in Kartli. The young Pharnavaz would then live in hiding with his mother and sisters while Alexander the Great stampeded through the rest of Darius III's empire. Eventually, his grandfather Darius would be killed by his own men. This death should have sealed the deal on Pharnavaz staying in hiding with his mother and sisters, but somehow it did not. Legend states that one day while Pharnavaz was hunting, he came upon a cave. This cave was loaded to the brim with unimaginable treasures of unimaginable wealth. The newly rich Pharnavaz would use this newly acquired wealth to hire a mercenary army to fight with him in his quest to dispose of the man who took the throne of Kartli from his uncle when he was just a kid. Upon learning that a descendant of Kartlos was still alive, around 1,000 of Azo's loyal Georgian soldiers joined Pharnavaz's army. Word spread quickly to the neighboring kingdom of Colchis that hugged the Black Sea coastal territories on the borders of Iberia. Colchis and Kartli enjoyed similar Persian cultures and ethnic groups, so Pharnavaz found an easy ally in the ruler of Colchis. Kuji of Colchis and Pharnavaz would then combine their armies in an effort to dispose Azo of Iberia, the governor of Iberia that was appointed by Alexander. Kuji did not do this solely from the kindness of his heart, as he agreed to help Pharnavaz, but only if he could marry one of his sisters after this war was over. To this, Pharnavaz agreed, and the two marched to face the army of Azo. And at the age of 27, after a lifetime of hiding, Pharnavaz would finally be crowned as the king of all of Iberia after his army defeated and killed Azo in battle. After overthrowing the Greek-appointed governor, Pharnavaz would now need to ensure that what happened to him would never happen to one of his descendants. So one of his first acts was to send diplomatic missions to the Diadochi. The Diadochi were the generals who split up Alexander's empire after his premature death in 324 BC. The most powerful of these Diadochi was a man named Antiochus, who controlled land from Turkey to India. Antiochus did not punish Pharnavaz, but instead he allowed him to rule his newly acquired kingdom if he would agree to serve Antiochus. When the diplomatic mission returned, it was clear that Antiochus wanted him to be his vassal, seeing as Antiochus sent Pharnavaz a crown. With his southern border now secured by one of the largest land empires in the world, Pharnavaz would now look to the north, past the Caucasian mountains. To secure this border, he married a woman of Derdzak origin, and then married one of his sisters off to a powerful Sarmatian chief. With his mountain kingdom of Iberia under control, Pharnavaz would now look to set about improving the infrastructure of Iberia. After Kuji of Colchis agreed to become one of the governors under Pharnavaz, he now controlled a true Georgian kingdom that stretched from the Black Sea and nearly to the Caspian Sea in the east. The first project that Pharnavaz would undertake would be the construction of a fortress at Armazi. The fort was named after Arma, who was the god of the moon in their local religion. To further dedicate the fort, Pharnavaz then constructed a giant bronze statue of Arma just outside of the fort so that all may worship him as they please. He then continued to improve and rebuild forts that were destroyed in Alexander's Iberian campaign. But the most important contribution that Pharnavaz made to Georgia was definitely the creation of the Georgian script. This would standardize the Georgian language and make it the official language of Iberia. This language gave Georgians something to separate them culturally from the Hellenistic Diadochi and even the Persian Achaemenid Empire. Perhaps the most interesting part about Pharnavaz is the fact that he's the grandson of the last Achaemenid Persian king Darius III. And although he would never control the now dead empire, he can be seen as the Persian successor state to Darius III. Pharnavaz believed this too as he styled his court and government in the Persian style, clearly showing where he claimed his royal blood from. Pharnavaz would rule a total of 65 years and die at the age of 92. In old age even today, and certainly for the time period in which he lived. Pharnavaz would be buried directly in front of the bronze statue of Arma that he had ordered to be constructed. This showed that he was a faithful servant of this god. His son Sarmag would then be crowned in front of the bronze god, showing that he too would be a faithful servant to Arma. Pharnavaz is widely considered to be the first king of Georgia. His contributions to Georgian independence and language meant that all the future kings would claim descent from him. From a boy who was forced to live in hiding for much of his adolescence, to a king who reigned over half a century, King Pharnavaz is the originator of the Georgian state that somehow still exists in the modern world of today. Pharasmenes I would have been born just before the time of Jesus, right around 33 BC, and just like Jesus, Pharasmenes' pregnant mother would be forced to run away from her home in order to safely give birth to the now exiled Prince Pharasmenes. His mother is unnamed throughout the sources, but she was the daughter of Pharnavaz II, who ruled Iberia from 63 BC to 33 BC. His death came when an exiled prince of Iberia named Mirian II came back to Iberia to claim his throne at the head of a massive Parthian army. Pharasmenes' father was also killed in this conflict, and his name was Cartam of Colchis. He was a descendant of Cugi of Colchis through his marriage with Pharnavaz's first sister. Pharasmenes' mother thought that it would be a good idea to flee to the kingdom of Armenia. After all, Artaxerxes II of Armenia and his Roman allies would surely protect this pregnant woman and her infant son from the Parthian Empire. But she was wrong. After a series of events, the Roman general, Mark Antony, captured Artaxerxes and his family for refusing to help him while on campaign against the Parthians. While Artaxerxes would eventually be executed by Antony's wife, Cleopatra, his son would escape. His son's name was Artaxerxes, and who do you think he went to help him win his throne back? That's right, he went straight to the Parthians. After all, the enemy of your enemy is your friend. With no hope of protection from the Armenian king, Pharasmenes' mother went into hiding. She gave birth to the fatherless Pharasmenes. Then she waited. She probably knew that the Romans would return at some point, and when they did, they would want her son to be the king of Iberia. So she bided her time, while her two sons grew from infancy to adolescence. When Pharasmenes was just entering his teenage years, Armenia came under the ownership of a new king. Artaxerxes was so unpopular in Armenia due to his near tyrannical rule, so the Armenian people wrote to the emperor Augustus. They asked the Roman emperor to remove Artaxerxes, so his brother, Tigranes III, could be placed in his stead. Tigranes III had been captured along with his family, but was not executed by Cleopatra along with his father. Instead, he was left imprisoned, and when Cleopatra and Mark Antony were defeated by Augustus, Augustus saw a use in keeping the exiled prince and took him back to live in Rome with him. Tigranes III was educated in Rome and would return to Armenia in 20 BC. His reign was a peaceful one, and for the next 12 years, he would rule. This was exactly the kind of opportunity Pharasmenes and his family needed. This would guarantee them a spot in the Armenian court that was oh so close to the Iberian court. The Iberian court, at the same time, also experienced a change in leadership, as the usurper Mirian II died, and his son, Artaxerxes II of Iberia, would succeed him, in that same year of 20 BC. Pharasmenes spent his time in the Armenian court, probably growing up along with the children of King Tigranes III. His two children were named Tigranes and Aratu, and when King Tigranes III died in 8 BC, things got weird between his kids, because, well, they married each other, and both became king and queen of Armenia. King Tigranes IV and Queen Aratu hated Roman vassalage, and looked to the Parthian Empire to liberate them, further showing how much of a competition it was to own these two small border kingdoms, nestled between the Roman and Parthian empires. Parthia tried to help release Tigranes IV and Aratu from Roman vassalage, but when Rome threatened that they would invade Parthia, Parthia backed off. Now the dual monarchs are forced to face Augustus alone, but were pleasantly surprised when Augustus continued to let them rule Armenia. This did not sit well with some of the Armenians, who now revolted against Tigranes and Aratu. King Tigranes IV would march with an army to crush these rebels. Unfortunately, the rebels would kill him in 1 AD, and this would force his sister to abdicate her throne to a distant relative, handpicked by Augustus. While King Tigranes IV would die with his Armenian army, a different Armenian army would prove to be very successful. Although they had a much different goal in mind. Instead of quelling internal revolt, a general would invade Iberia with Armenian soldiers. This general's name was Pharasmenes I, and he was here for only one reason: to retake his grandfather's kingdom. This Armenian army would eventually face the current king of Iberia, Artaxerxes II. During this battle, an arrow would find Artaxerxes II and kill him on the spot. On the battlefield, the remaining Iberians would crown Pharasmenes as their new king. Finally, this exiled prince would become king and return to Iberia as a Roman vassal in 1 AD, the same year as the birth of Jesus. Shortly after becoming king, he married the inbred daughter of the deceased King Tigranes IV and had 3 kids with her. First was his heir and son named Radamistus. Then after the birth, they had another son named Mirhat, and then another son after him named Azimaspos. Pharasmenes was born and raised in Armenia, and he would return to his homeland in 35 AD. He would return to Armenia in the exact same way that he left it, at the head of an army. This time, he was assisting his Roman overlord to reclaim suzerainty over Armenia. This overlordship was once again interrupted by the Parthian Empire, when one of their kings, tried to put one of his sons on the Armenian throne. This son's name was Arsaces, and he was so disliked by the Armenians that one of his servants poisoned him. In his place, the new Roman emperor, Tiberius, would order for Pharasmenes' brother to become the new king of Armenia. After all, he was born and raised there. So in 35 AD, Mithridates, the brother of Pharasmenes, would become the king of Armenia after being assisted by the Roman and Iberian armies. Mithridates only ruled for about 2 years, before the mad emperor Caligula had him arrested in order to put a Parthian prince back on the throne of Armenia. This offered a better compromise for Rome, as Iberia would be ruled by a Parthian prince but remain as a Roman vassal. The prince's name was Aretes, and the first thing that he did after becoming the Armenian king was execute the servants who had poisoned his brother just 2 years ago. After Emperor Caligula was murdered by his personal bodyguards called the Praetorian Guards, his uncle Claudius would become the emperor and release Mithridates from prison. After this, he instructed Pharasmenes to put his brother back on the throne of Armenia. Pharasmenes listened, and once again, the two brothers entered their Armenian homeland at the head of a huge Iberian army. The king of Armenia, Aretes, would get support from his father, King Artabanzus of Parthia. These Parthian and Iberian armies would clash in a pitched battle, with Pharasmenes personally leading his army. While in combat, Pharasmenes and Aretes ended up fighting one another. The two fought on horseback for a time, until one of them struck a decisive blow. Pharasmenes hit Aretes on the head and smashed his helmet in with one blow. The now concussed and dazed Aretes turned his horse and fled from the battle, with his army following shortly behind him. Mithridates was then reinstated to his throne in 42 AD, and the two brother kings once again ruled over their two kingdoms. Over the next 10 years, the good relationship held between Mithridates and Pharasmenes soured so bad that Pharasmenes instructed his firstborn son, Radamistus, to invade Armenia and overthrow his own uncle. This guy, Radamistus, was the worst, and he invaded Armenia and eventually convinced his uncle that he would not harm him if he would just leave his fortress and make peace with him. Eventually, Mithridates left the fortress of Gornias and was met by the embracing presence of his nephew. With convincing words, he lured Mithridates into the woods, where they would conduct a ceremony of peace. Before the ceremony could begin, though, one of Radamistus' men grabbed the legs of Mithridates and pinned him to the ground. Then Radamistus had him executed by stacking clothes and beds on him until he suffocated. Radamistus then butchered the rest of Mithridates' family, only deciding to keep one of his cousins alive. He spared Zenobia, the daughter of Mithridates, and married her before he became king in 51 AD. The new Parthian king named Vologases saw this as a weakness and invaded Armenia to put his brother on the Armenian throne. This brother's name was Tiridates. What is this, like the third different Tiridates now? Anyways, after a year of campaign, Radamistus was defeated and fled back to Iberia in 53 AD. The king had made a mistake by letting Radamistus escape, though. He would return a year later in 54 and was more psychotic than ever. He retook Armenia and punished whole cities for surrendering to the Parthian armies. After a year of this tyrannical treatment, the Armenian people revolted, and once again Radamistus and Zenobia were forced back to Iberia. Zenobia, after years of running and enduring a marriage with the man who murdered her whole family, asked Radamistus to finish his work and to murder her as well. Radamistus then stabbed his wife with a scimitar and left her body to float down the Aras River. Her body floated on the water and was eventually pulled out by a local man. Astonishingly, Zenobia still clung on to life. The man then bandaged her wound. While healing from her wound, the man learned who she was and handed her over to the Armenian king and Parthian prince Tiridates, who had taken the Armenian throne during the recent revolt. Seeing the tragedy that Zenobia had endured, he welcomed her and treated her as a noble, a bittersweet ending to a very tragic tale. As for Radamistus, he returned to his father. Pharasmenes welcomed his son back for a time, until the Roman Empire called. They wanted Radamistus dead. His actions almost caused an all-out war between Rome and Parthia, even though Pharasmenes both helped and told his son to take Armenia from his brother. So in 58 AD, possibly as one of the last orders that the 91-year-old King Pharasmenes gave, was for the execution of his firstborn son. This would guarantee peace between the Roman Empire and his second-born son, Mirhat. Shortly after Radamistus' execution, Pharasmenes would die, in that same year of 58 AD. Pharasmenes was born into a time of constant warfare between Rome and Parthia, who both took turns owning and fighting over the kingdoms of Iberia and Armenia. Although Pharasmenes was able to reclaim Iberia and return it under Roman control, he was cursed with a psychotic, power-hungry son. King Pharasmenes' 57-year reign was a good one for Iberia and a very, very bad one for Armenia. But he realized, perhaps too late, that Radamistus had to be stopped. Pharasmanes II was named after his great-grandfather, Pharasmanes I. His father was Amazap I, the current king of Iberia. His mother's name was Gadana, and she was the daughter of the current king of Parthia, Vologases III. It is unknown when he was born, but it can be assumed that he was born between the years of 85 and 100 AD. There really isn't much information for the early part of Pharasmanes' life, but we can assume that he grew up in the Iberian court alongside his cousins and siblings. In 116, his father would tragically die, and in his place, Pharasmanes II would become the 13th king of Iberia. He's described in the sources as being a handsome man, full of compassion, and a brave, capable warrior. He was such a brave warrior that he even earned the nickname of the Valiant. Just 1 year after Pharasmanes II came to power, a new emperor was also rising in Rome. In the summer of 117, Hadrian would become the Roman emperor. Since the time of his great-grandfather came to the Iberian throne in 1 AD, Iberia had practically been a vassalized state of Rome, just barely outside of the status of a puppet kingdom. This was a good thing when a new Roman emperor was crowned, because it meant one thing for Iberia. Gifts! Emperor Hadrian sent gifts to all of his new subjects, but he saved the biggest and best gift for the Iberians. To Pharasmanes II, he gifted an African war elephant that was accompanied by 50 men. How could a gift so great be repaid by the tiny little Iberian kingdom? Well, it really couldn't be, but Pharasmanes II tried, and he sent a few gifts. Namely, he sent about 300 gold-embroidered cloaks back to Emperor Hadrian. Hadrian felt insulted by this. I don't know what he expected from Pharasmanes, but his response was comic. To taunt Pharasmanes and to show his superiority over the king, he dressed 300 condemned criminals in the gold-embroidered cloaks that were gifted to him. He then sent them to the Colosseum, where they killed each other dressed in the cloaks that a small kingdom had sent to Rome. When Pharasmanes learned of this, he was understandably upset, so he plotted, and finally devised a plan for revenge. He went to the eastern borders of his kingdom, and there he spoke with a group of steppe nomads called the Alans. He offered them free passage through his land if they would raid the land of the Romans. The Alans agreed, and proceeded through Iberia, attacking the Roman land to the west of Iberia. After this sequence of back-and-forth gifts that got progressively more worse and more deadly, Pharasmanes was left with a barely intact alliance with Rome. Still, he tested the most powerful empire on earth and walked away to tell a tale. King Pharasmanes II was obviously trying to separate Iberia from Rome in an effort to move it closer to Parthia. After all, his wife was a Parthian princess. Through wanting to move closer to Parthia, he started to employ an increasing amount of Parthians at the Iberian royal court. One of these Parthians that he employed was a world-renowned chef. Moving away from Rome and closer to Parthia would prove to be a terrible decision, though. This was proven after Pharasmanes II ate a delicious meal from this Parthian chef. The chef used a delicious and zesty seasoning named poison, and King Pharasmanes II died shortly after he was done with dinner in 132 AD, leaving his son Gadam to become king of Iberia. King Pharasmanes II was an okay king. It is unfortunate that we don't have more information on his life. If you want to hear more about Georgian history and history in general, remember to hit the subscribe button below. And with that out of the way, let's talk about Mirian III. He was born in the year of 277 as a minor noble born to the House of Mirhan. The House of Mirhan is one of the 7 Iranian noble houses and can claim descent from the old Parthian dynasty that had ruled over Persia since 227 BC. In 224 AD, Parthia would be overthrown by the current Sassanid Empire. This new Sassanid Empire allowed the House of Mirhan to keep their mountainous kingdom of Iberia that would later become Georgia. This tiny kingdom had long served as a battleground for Roman and Parthian armies and was constantly traded between the two powers either through vassalization or outright conquest. Around the same time that this was happening, a new religion was spreading like wildfire throughout the Roman world. The cult of Christianity had spread from the land of Judea, and now there was even Christians practicing their new religion even in Iberia. Although this community would remain small due to the overwhelming number of Zoroastrianists that practiced their Iranian-based religion. This was a much different Georgia than one would naturally think, and was more closely related to Persia in culture than the Western influences that would soon take hold of Georgia and refuse to let go. Mirian was not born as the son of the Iberian king. He was actually the cousin of the king, who was now fighting off a Sassanid invasion. Why were they invading Iberia? Well, Iberia had been forced into Roman vassalization about 10 years ago at the conclusion of one of the Roman Sassanid wars. This was all fine until the Roman emperor named Carus decided to start a new war, and he attacked and devastated Sassanid armies. Rome would be winning this war until the heroic leadership of Carus would end, when he decided to stand outside in a storm in his full armor for too long and was struck by lightning. At least that's what some of the sources say, but considering that he was on campaign and considering that he lived in a period of time called the Crisis of the 3rd Century, it's more likely that he received a large dose of poison, which contributed to his death. His death would eventually result in the Sassanids kicking the new, poorly led Roman legions from their land. The king of Iberia, named Aspicures, already knew the next move that the Sassanid army would make. Shah Bahram II would then take his army to Iberia in an effort to regain Sassanid control of that land. King Aspicures would surprisingly meet the Shah on the battlefield with his much smaller Iberian army. Surprisingly, Aspicures won the battle and sent Bahram running for about 2 seconds until he turned around with his much larger army and crushed the Iberian king. Aspicures then ran from his kingdom into the neighboring Alania as a king in exile from his own land. This is where Mirian III would come into the story. You see, when Rome gained control over Iberia, the Sassanid Shah would decide to keep a few cousins of King Aspicures around, just in case something like this happened. And so Mirian was chosen and crowned as Mirian I, although we call him Mirian III today, due to previous kings of Georgia that he never claimed descent from. Anyways, King Mirian would marry Aspicurs' daughter, and his cousin, thus becoming king of Iberia in 284 as a Sassanid vassal state. But the question still stood. Why did Rome and Persia flip-flop this poor little kingdom back and forth constantly? Well, the problem lies with Iberia's mountainous geography. Being dead center of the Caucasus Mountains meant that they controlled very important mountain passes that could cut weeks out of the schedule of both the Roman and Sassanid invasions. Almost like clockwork, another 10 years had passed, and that meant that it was time for Iberia to change ownership again. Sassanid, Persia, and Rome would once again go to war for what seemed like the 100th time at this point. Rome crushed the Sassanids this time, and they were re-given Iberia in 298 as a vassal state. King Mirian immediately pledged himself to the Roman Empire and enjoyed a close relationship with that giant empire. Little did King Mirian know, though, that this empire was collapsing from within. King Mirian would sit back and watch from his mountains as Romans would tear each other apart, all trying to decide on who should be their emperor. Eventually, a guy named Constantine would win these civil wars after painting symbols of the Christian gods on his army's shields before battle. When he became emperor, he prohibited anyone from persecuting Christians in the Roman Empire, further allowing the religion to spread. With their religion now legal, Christians started popping up everywhere, openly professing and preaching their faith. One of these preachers would be a woman named Nino, who was instructed by the Virgin Mary to preach the teachings of Jesus to the Iberian people. So she left from her home of Bethlehem and ventured into the neighboring kingdom of Armenia. In Armenia, she was almost executed by the Armenian king, but she was the only one of the 35 Christians that Tiridates III of Armenia would spare in the upcoming execution. Then after this, she made her way into the tiny kingdom of Iberia. Some sources claim that this never happened, and she was taken to Iberia and sold there as a slave. But potato, no matter what, Nino was here, and she was preaching by the year 320. Upon arrival, Nino made a stick cross that was tied together with a grapevine and placed it in the center of the first village that she came to. Most of Iberia at this time practiced Zoroastrianism, but some, including King Mirian and his family, believed in native Iberian gods. Somehow the Queen of Iberia named Nana learned about Nino's preachings, and she tried to seek an audience with the wandering preacher. The two met, and upon meeting, Nino healed the mortally sick queen back to full health. The Iberian queen then agreed to be baptized, much to the dismay of her husband, King Mirian, who did not want to let go of his old religion. The king then started to become aggressive towards the Christians in his kingdom, who were only growing due to Nino's frequent religious conversions. While hunting one day, the king was in the woods. A strange and pitch-black darkness then overtook Mirian's vision. Mirian thought he was dying, and in a panic he started calling out the names of all the gods that he knew, until he screamed to Nino's god. He said, "If indeed that Christ whom the captive had preached to his wife was God, then let him now deliver him from this darkness, that he too might forsake all the other gods to worship him." With the end of this prayer, the darkness went away, and King Mirian had just renounced all of his other gods to this one god, and would finally be converted by Nino in 323. And just 3 years later, Iberia would become the second state ever to adopt Christianity as its state religion in 326, following its Armenian brother to the south. When King Mirian informed Emperor Constantine about his kingdom's conversions, he was so excited that he granted the Iberians with bishops and priests who convinced King Mirian to build a grand cathedral, which was started in 334 and was not finished until after the death of King Mirian. King Mirian's death would come shortly after he returned from a religious pilgrimage to the city of Jerusalem. The burial place of the king would not be this planned massive cathedral, but instead, they would be interred in Samtavaro Monastery, built next to the small church that Nino gave some of her first Georgian sermons at. Nino would later be canonized as a saint for her efforts in converting the Georgian people. Both Nino and King Mirian can be credited with the large-scale adoption of the Christian religion that so many Iberians would adhere to. This religious adoption is one of the few ways how Georgia would forge its unique culture. This culture now had something to hold on to that made it something more than just one of the 7 Iranian houses of Persia, and more than just a Roman province whose empire would not even sponsor Christianity until 380. 56 years after King Mirian I, the first Christian king of Georgia, did it. Vahaktang Gorgasali was born sometime around the year of 440, inside of the Kingdom of Iberia. He was the son of Mithridat V, the current king of Iberia. His mother's name was Sagdukt, and she was a princess from the neighboring kingdom of Armenia. When translated into Iranian, Vakhtung translates to wolf-bodied, a great name for any future king to hold. I mean, wouldn't you be scared to fight someone who's literally a wolf man? Anyways, Prince Vahaktung's father, Mithridat V, dies and leaves Vakhtung as the 32nd king of Iberia. Nothing wrong with that until you realize that Vahaktung is only a 7-year-old. He's crowned king in 447. This would leave his mother in charge of the kingdom until Vahaktung turned 16. Vahaktung couldn't turn 16 soon enough though, as his kingdom was under constant threat of raids from nomadic tribes to the north of Iberia. These tribes were most likely the Alans that have long lived north of Iberia. The Alans weren't invading as much as they were running though. A new nomadic threat had arrived in the form of the Huns, who had pushed numerous Germanic Goths into the Eastern and Western Roman empires. In 456, these running Alan tribes raided their way into Ossetia and settled in the region in the north of Iberia. After the Alans had captured Vahaktung's sister, the newly independent ruling 16-year-old King Vahaktung would gather his army to face the Alans. Vahaktung gathered an army for nothing though, as there would be no battle between the two hosts. Instead, there would only be a duel. The duel would pit the 16-year-old king against the hand-picked champion of the Alans, who seemed a giant to his teenage opponent. And just as David had killed Goliath, Vahaktung would slay his much larger and older opponent. It looked like this wolf had some serious teeth. This secured the release of his sister and firmly planted Vahaktung's supremacy over the Alans. This would only be a temporary victory for his kingdom and people. Soon, he would be forced to fight the much larger Hunnic threat that had now crept its way closer and closer to the Caucasus Mountains. Luckily, these mountains provided a crucial obstacle that would make it hard for any nomadic tribe to cross, but still, the Huns raided his land. He would fight back against their raids in 460, when the neighboring kingdom of Albania attempted to gain independence from the Sassanid overlords to the south. This was Vahaktung's overlord as well, as the Sassanid Persians had made Iberia one of their vassal kingdoms about 40 years ago. Vahaktung may have thought about revolting along with Albania, until the king of Albania invited the raiding Huns into his kingdom, so that they could fight the Sassanids for him. He assisted the Sassanids in kicking out the raiding Huns, and helped them regain control over the area. Vahaktung assisted the Sassanids once again in 474, when the Sassanid Shah gathered an army to face the Huns in open battle. This was a bad idea, and the Shah was ambushed and captured by the Huns. Vahaktung now served an imprisoned king that was set up for ransom. This ransom payment would come from a very unlikely place, and in the form of the Byzantine emperor's ruler, Zeno. The Sassanid Shah would not let his capture go unpunished, as he assembled another army to fight the Hunnic horde. The Shah would once again be soundly defeated and captured though. This Shah was now thoroughly embarrassed, completely broke from having to pay his own ransom, and had a few vassals that wanted to exploit his apparent weakness. In 482, King Vahaktung ordered for the execution of Varsechin, who was a noble that was appointed to watch over him by the Sassanid Empire. This execution came when Varsechin had the daughter of the Armenian king, Vardan II, executed. Varsechin married the Armenian princess a few years ago, but grew appalled by her Christian religion. When she refused to give up Christianity in favor of Varsechin's Zoroastrianism, he had her killed. This martyr's death then triggered the Christian nations of Iberia and Armenia to revolt. At the same time that this revolt was starting, King Vahaktung married a relative of Emperor Zeno, moving himself closer and closer to the Roman Empire. And then in a stroke of brilliance, he asked for permission to create a separate church from that of the one headquartered in Constantinople. Then in one swoop, Vahaktung revolted against the Sassanids and created a Georgian Orthodox Church to move closer toward an alliance with the Byzantine Empire. King Vahaktung knew that he couldn't face the Sassanids alone, so he created an alliance with King Vardan II of Armenia and an old enemy, the Huns. He was now employing a similar strategy that Albania had tried to use about 20 years earlier when they had tried to win their independence. This strategy would prove to produce similar results, though. 2 years after his revolution had started, King Vahaktung would be forced to flee to the neighboring Byzantine vassal state of Lazica, which encompassed much of the Colchis region to the west of Iberia. In an act of kindness, the victorious Sassanid Shah decided to put Vahaktung back onto the throne of Iberia. The restored Georgian king stopped rebelling against the Sassanids, who allowed him to keep the infant Georgian Orthodox Church. King Vahaktung and Iberia would then live in relative peace for the next 18 years. During these 18 years, the now aged king spent plenty of time hunting in the forests of Iberia. One day while he was navigating the forests that surround the Kura River, he noticed a white smoke rising above the forest canopy. His hunting falcon was already chasing a pheasant and flying towards the smoke. King Vahaktung followed, and was pleasantly surprised when he discovered that the smoke was from multiple hot springs that seemed to warm the air. He was less pleasantly surprised when he looked into one of the hot springs and discovered the boiled remains of his falcon that still clenched a pheasant in his talons. King Vahaktung enjoyed the hot springs so much that he decided to construct a new city to exploit the steamy warm clouds of water vapor. He would name the city Tbilisi, which translates to warm location. King Vahaktung was not the first Georgian king to settle this location, but he did start the process of constructing a city that was worthy enough to become the capital of Georgia up until the present day. 18 years of Iberian peace lasted, until the Anastasian War broke out in 502. Shah Kavad of the Sassanid Empire declared war on the Eastern Roman Empire to take money that Eastern Rome had owed him. Kavad implored for Vaktung to join him, after all he was his vassal, but Vahaktung sided with his more religiously in line neighbor of the Byzantines. This would result in the Sassanids invading Iberia, and once again kicking Vahaktung out of Iberia. He would continue to fight against the Sassanids with his new Roman ally, but unfortunately, this would be the Wolf King's final war. While fighting the Sassanids, and at the age of 63, he was shot through a gap in his armor, located at his armpit. The king would be carried away to Ujarma Castle by his men, where he would die shortly after. In his will, King Vahaktung instructed his son, and the now King Dachi, to move the capital of Iberia to the newly constructed city of Tbilisi. The contributions that Vahaktung made to Georgian culture is staggering, when considering that he created the Georgian Orthodox Church and put into word where he wanted the new capital to be. These two things that he left Georgia would both become hotbeds of Georgian culture, with Tbilisi becoming the seat of most of the future Georgian kings who would all adhere to the Georgian Orthodox Church.